Our next presentation is a remote from Washington, D.C., and it's Shawnee Delaney, who is a regular speaker at this conference. If you look at her bio, a fascinating life, intelligence poacher turned gamekeeper, doing good. Hi, Delaney.
How are you?
How are you doing, Shawnee?
Good.
Good. You haven't got your hat this time.
No.
Good. Well, welcome. I was just saying a little bit about you, referring your bio to the audience, and to let them know you're going to talk about employment life cycle management to mitigate the insider threat. Over to you.
Super sexy, right? Thank you. I really appreciate you guys having me here today again. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. Trust me, it is probably much warmer there than it is here in Washington, D.C. today. But I'm really excited to talk to you about employment lifecycle management and how it can help mitigate insider threats. Now, I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to jump right in. Some of you might know the entrepreneur Gary Vaynerchuk. He once said that company culture is the backbone of any successful organization. An employee's life cycle encompasses several stages throughout their career. Now, this begins with recruitment and concludes with resignation, retirement, or termination. Today, I'll share with you how organizations can establish an employment lifecycle program in order to give employees consistency throughout their careers, which can help you prevent insider threats as a result. So by doing this, you'll be able to understand important interdependencies and touch points, interactions, and disparities, really, in insider threat protection strategies. So this all starts with company culture or organizational culture, whatever you want to call it. Company culture is evident in the way employees of an organization make decisions, how they interact with one another, how the overall values that they hold. It encompasses an array of elements such as leadership styles, shared values, principles, ethics, goals, the organizational mission and vision, and the work environment itself. That's actually a big one, among many other things. With a strong company culture, employees understand their expected behaviors and the outcomes, and they act appropriately. So now let's discuss insider threat. I am sure that you all have heard this term, and many organizations recently, thankfully, have recognized that they need to have an insider threat or insider risk program. Again, you could call it different things. However, most people could not really truly explain what insider threat really means, what it is, what it encompasses. So the way I describe it is if you think about it as a large umbrella, and it covers a wide range of actions from unintentional or accidental to negligence to malicious acts. And that can encompass anything from fraud, sabotage, espionage, my personal favorite, workplace violence, theft of intellectual property and trade secrets, media leaks, etc. Now, it's really critical to understand that insider threats can come not just from current employees or contractors, but very often they stem from former employees, vendors, business partners, or other third parties. Essentially, anyone who has or had legitimate access to your organization's networks, facilities, systems, they can abuse, they can misuse, or they can threaten your confidentiality, your integrity, your availability, your people, or your resources. Excuse me, my kids got me sick, and they tell me sharing is caring, but I don't believe them in this case. Okay, so really quickly, I want to touch on the difference between the different types of insider threat, because there are several. So first we have unintentional. That includes mistakes, right? That's an employee who accidentally clicks on a malicious link, or maybe they accidentally emailed an internal document to an external party. Generally, it's caused by a lack of awareness. Now, when I do interviews and investigations, more often than not, I hear, but I didn't know. So oftentimes when an organization has a lack of adequate training, or they have policies that are not communicated, or maybe the policies don't exist, they have a lack of security procedures, or they don't enforce any of their policies, all of that contributes to increased unintentional insider acts. Excuse me. Second, we have negligent insider threat, and that's different. This is usually where an organization has adequate security training or policies, etc., but there's no enforcement by the organization. Oftentimes, these are people who know the policies, but they choose to ignore them. They're complacent, they're careless, and very often they're taking shortcuts here, knowing that they shouldn't, but they choose to anyway. Excuse me. A good example is when people email themselves work documents to work on a personal computer or print at home, something that's more comfortable. So again, they know they shouldn't do it, but it's easier. You know, they're not doing anything bad that causes the company or the organization some risk. Third, we have malicious acts. This is where someone's needs, whatever those needs are not being met. And what's really, really critical here is that can be real or it can be perceived. So they seek to intentionally harm an organization or a person. Usually it's for personal benefit or they're acting on a personal grievance. They're disgruntled, they've got those unmet expectations. Fourth, we have compromised insiders. This is where an external party takes advantage of a negligent or unintentional insider by credential theft or collusion. Sometimes one or more insiders will collaborate with an external actor, often for financial gain. With COVID-19, it's been really increased. Fraud in particular has increased a lot, and organized criminal groups reaching out and trying to recruit insiders. So again, you've got cyber criminals, organized crime groups, and often this type of insider threat is really hard to detect. And then finally, there are third parties, as I mentioned earlier. Those are your vendors, your contractors, your business partners. They could be targeted directly or indirectly and used to gain access. A good example would be if you think about MSPs, the managed service providers. If someone hacked into their system or maybe stole an engineer's credentials, they potentially could gain access to all of the MSP's client networks. Frightening. So I have some good news here. Unintentional and negligent insider threats, they do account for the vast majority of cases. According to Carnegie Mellon University, the reported cases of unintentional and negligent is about 62%. I emphasize reported. People have started reporting more in recent years. I think people are getting more comfortable with it. However, personally, in all the years that I have done this, I've seen that category much, much higher. I would say about 75 to 85% of cases that I've investigated have been unintentional or negligent. So the good news is that this category is correctable. You can train this behavior away, especially when much of it comes down to simple ignorance. You can bring awareness to people so they're better familiar with cyber hygiene practices, which, as we all know, especially today, are critical. You can educate them that insider threat isn't scary. It shouldn't be. It should be a transparent program. It's essentially every employee taking responsibility to help protect their organization. It's understanding that they and that we all are insiders. So additionally, to drive down the unintentional risk, you can create more robust policies and procedures. You can enhance detection capabilities, among many other things that unfortunately I don't have time to get into today. But it is important to note that the malicious acts, you cannot train away. I would argue that you can mitigate them further, and that if someone knows what to look for and reports it, which comes with training, which I'll touch on later. So you can imagine that there are many actions and touch points throughout a person's career that are critical to managing insider threat. So this is where managing the employment lifecycle comes in. So what's employment lifecycle? As I mentioned in the beginning, it's that whole span of a person's career with you. You've got recruitment, onboarding, development, retention, and then offboarding. There are a number of steps that you can take throughout this life cycle that will mitigate the threat posed by insider threats. And I want to share some examples with you for each of those steps. So recruitment and interviewing in this phase, make sure that candidates are a good cultural fit. And that goes both ways. Make sure that you are a good fit for them too. Otherwise, the likelihood of them getting disgruntled or unhappy really does increase. Organizations with established cultures and values can help to avoid really expensive hiring mistakes by determining if a candidate's beliefs, values, behaviors align with those of the organization. Next, I'd say ensure that culture plays a role in your vetting and interviews. For example, ask interview questions to determine if they know and understand your culture. If they don't, the likelihood is it isn't a good fit. That likelihood increases. Also, that they didn't do their homework. That's not a good sign. Try to assess their cultural priorities. Do those align with yours? Ensure that you have a known and a publicized culture. Can your employees recite your cultural values? Do you put emphasis on culture with current employees? The next thing I would suggest is to conduct pre-employment screening. Now, this might seem logical, but so many organizations either don't do it or they do it after the fact. I used to be a background investigator for police and fire services in California, like 800 years ago. And I can tell you that there were a large number of people who I interviewed that should never be given a weapon or power. Doing background checks really uncovers a lot of useful information in hiring decisions. And just between us, my favorite question was, tell me something you've done in your life that you're ashamed of. You got some really weird answers when you asked that question. I don't think you can ask that question, but it was a good one. Next, so with background checks. So when you're doing criminal checks, consider looking at other places that they've lived. Some places, some countries will only look in the current address area. For example, in Brazil, background checks are only allowed to be, criminal checks are allowed to be in the state that they live in. And if that person had committed heinous crimes all around the country, it never would be pulled up. Again, this is super important to do before the person is hired. There's one case that I assisted with an employee who was hired, and then the background check was conducted, and it was found out that there were really serious criminal charges that most likely would have disqualified that candidate, and then the organization was scrambling to figure out what to do. Also, speak with people who are not references. We all know that the references are the people that are going to say only glowing things about them. We want to know who else should we talk to that might have information. And very often you'll get, down the list and get some good intel. Consider doing open source intelligence checks, OSINT, or social media checks. Now, I'm saying do this legally. Speak with your counsel. Don't go creating fake accounts. Don't violate terms of service. Like, we're not stalking here. But this is basically reviewing open source and public information to see if they're a good culture fit. I used to use, when I was conducting espionage, I used to use open source and social media all the time for targeting people that I wanted to develop as a source. And then recruit or hire only those people that are a good fit. If you sense something is off, listen to your gut. Despite people's credentials, don't move forward. So when you get to onboarding someone, you can onboard with cyber hygiene, insider threat, and other security training. They need to understand that this is important to your organization. I would add that emphasize culture in that training, ensure that they're starting fresh, and they're knowing that your organization prioritizes a security culture. Also in onboarding, emphasize the need to report concerns, kind of that see something, say something mentality, or stand up, speak up, or whatever cute little tagline you can come up with. And lastly, for that phase, I would consider a probationary period, if you don't already, to see how that person actually works. I've seen a number of cases where this period was critical to seeing toxic behavior of the person, or they committed fraud right away, or things like that. Then during the development and retention phase, really work to foster a positive employee experience. Now that obviously, depending on your industry, that can entail a whole host of things, from perks and benefits to pay, to praise, to swag, to massages on Friday. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Just take steps transparently to make your employees happy and feel valued. That will really, really decrease your malicious incidents. So you'll need to do continual performance reviews, which should also include cultural fit assessments. And this could be done by highlighting how that person embodies or doesn't embody the company's cultural values. Seek to reward good employees. That's another thing. Everyone really wants and deserves to feel appreciated. Continue that ongoing training annually. You can do micro learnings, which are like 3 to 5 minute trainings monthly or quarterly. The goal of this is to keep the topics fresh in their mind. This should not be like a one and done, check the box, you're good to go forever. And then in the same vein as taking care of your people, just retain those good employees. Remember that if someone's needs are not being met, real or perceived, they are more likely to cause an insider threat incident. With background investigations, I suggest conducting consensual background reinvestigations, especially when you're dealing with higher risk people or positions, someone who has access to kind of crown jewels, things like that. People's circumstances may change. I've seen it more times than I can count. You want to know if someone is undergoing some difficult life changes. Encourage reporting. And some organizations can even consider incentivizing it. There are pros and cons to that as well. Solicit feedback from employees, send out culture surveys, security surveys. Don't just send them out and ignore the results either. Be transparent again and show employees what you're doing to improve based on their feedback. And then update your values, your cultural norms, your security policies and procedures as needed. These really should be living documents. Personally, I've found that each insider threat case that I've investigated is really so different from the next that I've had to approach organizations to update loopholes and policies quite often. Now, finally, the offboarding period. Now, offboarding is one of the most critical touch points here. You need to have a global consistency. For example, who terminates people? Is it HR? Is it the manager? Do both of them sit in on the meeting? Is there a process in place, or does each country or region do it differently or do it their own way? You need to create a process. So for example, make sure that once someone is being terminated or they're resigning, all network access is terminated, facility access is revoked, and company assets are returned. Those sound like really basic, simple solutions. You're like, duh, of course, but you would be shocked how many people fail to do that, or because there's not a process, it slips through the cracks and people don't get access shut off. And again, that's where people who used to have credentials or access can still access systems. Mm-hmm. And then exit interviews and feedback. Look at departing and former employees as really valuable resources of information, which can be used to enhance the organization and improve issues. When someone's going out the door, they're much more likely to tell you the ground truth. So be willing to listen. One thing that I tell people all the time is have an offboarding checklist. In this checklist, you really should make sure to ask whoever's doing that termination, have you ever sent, or saved company proprietary data or internal data to a USB device, an external hard drive, unapproved cloud storage? Have you sent external emails with company data? Most people, if they're not asked, they're not going to tell you. So having someone ask them, and then when they say, oh yeah, I've got the, this 5 terabyte hard drive here. Well, great, that's ours. We're going to need that back. And then lastly, understand the important triggers. Keep it positive and try to avoid those triggers. Outgoing parties often might feel unheard or undervalued and pushed out the door. And this is that trigger that leads them to commit malicious acts on their way out or following termination. Remember, I said someone might perceive that their needs are not being met. So let's say someone didn't get a raise or the bonus that they feel like they deserved, and they're not happy with their manager. So they've become very disgruntled. Then they get laid off, and all that frustration and emotion is triggered when their system's access is shut off as they walk into their termination meeting. So when they leave that termination feeling down and dejected, they want to send that farewell email to their colleagues, and they can't. So that leads them to, that's their trigger, and that leads them to commit theft or sabotage or blast the company on social media. So I know I'm getting short on time, and just to wrap up, I feel like I've talked really fast because I have so much I want to squeeze in here. So while not all insider threats are preventable, the vast majority are. And organizations can greatly mitigate their risks by putting effort into managing that employment lifecycle properly. Now, coupled with a strong training and awareness program to teach employees what insider threat is, how they can cause it, and what red flag indicators are there that they should report, companies can ensure that their whole enterprise has a solid foundation and an understanding of what's expected of them, what they are responsible for, and why embracing their company culture is so important. Thank you again for your time, and good luck.
Shawnee, thank you very much indeed for an outstanding presentation highlighting the insider threat. You've all got a threat in your organization. You don't know it, but I guarantee you've got one. Disenchanted, unhappy, some brain dysfunction, but they can cause your company reputation loss and financial loss. Don't have accounts in your database for people that no longer work there, and make sure that you strip them of those credentials, which they shouldn't have, that if a hacker gets in and gets that account, can exploit your network really badly. Shawnee, good to see you. My love to DC.
Thank you.
And all my friends over there, and I look forward to seeing you at one of our events again. God bless you.
Likewise.
Take care.
Thank you.